Okay guys, so this video is going to be focusing on bullet 3. Um, so bullet 3 is very similar to Bentham, but not quite the same. When it comes to Bentham, I stressed his principle of utility, the 3 parts of the principle of utility, and what it would mean to apply the principle. When it comes to Kant, if you're going to, when you get to Kant or you decide to focus on Kant, to analyze and critique your reasoning for item 2, we're going to use a slightly different approach. We're going to have a slightly different concern. And as you can see in the first bullet, so I'm reading from right there. According to Kant, what would have to be true about the government's orders to shelter in place to deem said decision morally praiseworthy? So, of course, I have write at least 3 sentences, and then I tell you, like with Bentham, to quote something. Reread all of that prompt on your own, but notice that I do talk about, I do give you specific page numbers. So now what I want to do is call your attention to the fact that, unlike Bentham, we're not focused on Kant's general moral principle, the categorical imperative, his supreme principle, the supreme categorical imperative, and how it can be used to generate other categorical imperatives, also called duties. We're not going to focus on that part. If you want to learn more about that part, then what you'll want to do is take my ethics class or take any ethics class. Most ethics classes that are taught by philosophers will get more into that. Metaphysical or epistemological, what he takes, that organization. Oh, okay. We are back in business. It looks like we're back in business. So as you know, I gave you some pages to focus on, but now I want to help you narrow down some things even more, so take note. So when it comes to answering that question, what does it take for something to be worth more, what does it take for an action, choice, or decision to be morally praiseworthy, we're going to have to get deeper into the reading. And so I'm going to give you some clues. You'll want to start on page 482, and I want you to be looking for what the author says for Kant is the relationship between morality and reason or rationality. Go to page 483. What does the author tell you about Kant and what he thinks about intentions? What role should intentions play in deciding whether an act, choice, or decision is morally praiseworthy? Right after the author talks about intentions and what role, if any, of those play for Kant, the author goes on to emphasize what must be the motive, what must be motivating, what are the motives, what motives are necessary, or what motive is necessary for a government or an individual to consider said government or individual's choice or decision or action morally praiseworthy. What does the author say about correctly discerning duty? Then go to 484. It's very important to understand this, to consider the bigger question. Again, the bigger question is, from Kant's point of view, would it be, from Kant's perspective, the question is, what would it take for the government's decision to be morally praiseworthy to make you shelter in place? And so you really need to read very carefully through page 484. Look at what he says about the goodwill and consequences. Does he say that consequences matter? And what does he say about the goodwill and consequences? He gives you different scenarios and stuff like that. So what if you have a goodwill but bad consequences, goodwill, good consequences, bad will, good consequences, and whatnot? That will help you to better understand what is important, what all is entailed, necessary in terms of an action or decision being morally praiseworthy from the standpoint of Kant. The last example really drives home that point as you're reading from page 484 to the end of that section. 486, make sure you look at that as well. 487, what actions? Look at 487 as well, and then look at excerpt and partial paragraph on page 488. So write down all these things. So when I gave you the page numbers to read from Kant from 483 to 489, or from the Kant section of the chapter in the book, that was giving you the context how all the trees are connected in the forest. And now I've just given you specific pages and passages within that to focus on to answer the question that you have for that bullet. And now I need to add something else as well. So do remember that as you're reading these pages, you can skip everything that's in a lavender text box, everything that's in a peach text box. If it looks like I'm looking up because I have two screens and I get confused. You can skip the stuff in purple, you can skip the stuff in lavender text boxes, and you can skip most of the stuff with the thin blue line except for the stuff on page. Well, I wouldn't, but some of it I would, but definitely the excerpt with the thin blue line on page 488, read that because it has really important stuff. So be thinking about that. So you want to make sure that you get a good understanding of what Kant thinks it takes to be morally motivated in the right way, but Kant also goes through examples, the author also goes through examples of actions or decisions that might be decided as moral or as the right ones to take in a certain way, but according to Kant still would not be morally praiseworthy. So you want to work through all of the discussion to make sure you understand Kant, because understanding his counterexamples, understanding what Kant thinks would not make a decision or an action morally praiseworthy is vital to understanding what he takes to be necessary in making a moral decision morally praiseworthy. And you'll want to incorporate some of what you relearn in rereading this deeper into your paragraph. So again, I say, according to Kant, what would it have to be true about the government's orders to shelter in place to deem said decision morally praiseworthy? So then what I want you to do that I haven't stated here in writing is I want you to look at your item 2 response. In looking at your response, what would he say about it? Would he say that you used your reason in the right way, that you reflected a good will? Would he say that the way you got to your decision shows a proper motive? Would he say you were motivated in the right way to reach that decision or to reach that conclusion? If you said it was not rational for you to take a position, then you would just apply those questions to both sides of the debate that you post. So you could say, on the one side, he might say that side A that I gave was morally motivated in the right way because I explicitly or implicitly talk about X. But on the other side, he might say that I was focused on the wrong things and therefore my moral motivation is not correct. Now, you can't just say that. You have to tell me why and explain from Kant's point of view. That said, this is not an essay, okay? If you decide only to focus on the third bullet, everyone has to focus on the first bullet for step 6. But if you decide that you want to go with the third bullet and not the second bullet, remember, you got to write at least 6 sentences. You got to quote something. And you can't just say, yes, I was motivated in the right way. No, I was not motivated in the right way. You have to explain why, from Kant's point of view, does your reasoning for your conclusion, if you took a definite stance, or the reasoning for the different sides, if you presented opposing sides, why does the reasoning for a conclusion show that the reasoning was motivated in the right way for the moral conclusion to be considered morally praiseworthy, or the judgment to that the government, that it was morally permissible for the government to do something or not do something. So again, in a way, I do want you to critique your response. Would Kant say that your reasoning shows that you were motivated in the right way for your conclusion to be morally praiseworthy? Well, no, and I don't really want to say morally praiseworthy, but did you reason in the right way to show that the government is morally praiseworthy for its decision? So that's one way to look at it. But you could also look at it as, and so now I'm rethinking this, you could also look at it as talking about, would Kant say that you were you were focused on the right things, right, in deciding that it was not permissible for the government to make people shelter in place. So there's a variety of ways to tackle this. To recap, if you said that it was morally permissible for government to make a shelter in place, pretend to be Kant, look at the reasoning. Did you explicitly or implicitly show attention to the things that you read about in those pages and the excerpts I just gave you? Make sure you use his key terms, explain a couple of them. If so, would Kant say that not only did you reach the correct conclusion, but that you were motivated in the right way to discern that conclusion? And on top of that, would he say that the government itself was morally motivated in the right way? What would be problematic? What would we have to know from a Kantian perspective to know if the government deserves moral praise for making us shelter in place? So I guess that's one way to look at it. And then, would you deserve moral praise for the way you reason to your conclusion about the permissibility of government make us shelter in place? Again, if you didn't take a definite stance, you're just applying those questions to the two sides. I think that's all I've got for you, okay? Just be really careful not to conflate your own opinions and ideas about moral praise or motivation with Kant's. Kant is a very different thinker. He's radically different from Bentham when it comes to moral theory. So make sure you don't just scan the reading. Make sure you really try to understand before you start to write up and then submit your response. I will tell you that I think dealing with the Bentham bullet is easier and that you might want to do that. But again, it just depends on what you said in item 2 originally.